The morning sunlight poured softly through the blinds of William Carter's modest apartment, casting faint golden lines across the well-worn armchair he called his favorite. The room smelled faintly of lavender polish and yesterday's tea. Comforts of a quiet life lived in rhythm with the steady pulse of time. At 84, William moved at a pace that suited him. Deliberate and unhurried. He rose, his joints protesting faintly, and reached for his coat. The same dark woolen one he'd worn for years. It had seen countless winters and innumerable walks to the corner store. This morning, his errand was simple: pick up a carton of milk for his tea. A task so routine it bordered on ritual. The streets were alive with the energy of the city waking up. Cars passed in muted roars, their drivers preoccupied, faces fixed on destinations unknown to him. A young man jogged by with headphones on, nodding a polite good morning that William returned with a slight lift of his hat. He felt the crisp air bite his cheeks as he reached the familiar corner convenience store, its neon sign flickering faintly. Inside, the store was as it always was. Rows of colorful packaging lined the shelves, promising more than they could deliver. A couple of teenagers hovered near the snack aisle, laughing about something William didn't catch. The store manager, a woman with sharp features and watchful eyes, stood behind the counter. Her name tag read, Lisa, though she hadn't offered him her name before. William adjusted his glasses and made his way to the dairy section. He reached for the milk, his hand steady despite the stiffness of age. For a moment, he hesitated, as if considering whether to buy 2 cartons instead of 1. No sense in carrying more than I need, he murmured under his breath, a habit formed from years of living alone. As he turned toward the counter, he felt at the weight of someone's eyes. It wasn't uncommon for people to watch him. At his age, people often stared, sometimes with curiosity, other times with pity. But this was different. It was sharper, like a needle pressing into the edges of his presence. Lisa's gaze was fixed on him, her expression unreadable. She shifted slightly, pretending to straighten a display of gum, but her eyes darted back to him every few seconds. William felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a familiar unease, like the hum of a distant storm. He approached the counter with his single carton of milk, placing it gently down. Lisa's lips tightened, her fingers hovering over the register. Is that all for you today? She asked. Her tone clipped. Yes, William replied, his voice calm, though he noticed the slight tremor in his hands. He reached into his pocket for his wallet, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. As he handed over a few crumpled bills, he caught her glance toward his coat, then his shoes, as if cataloging his worth. The air felt heavy, the quiet tension of the moment pressing against him like an unwelcome shadow. Lisa hesitated, then spoke. We've had incidents here before, she said, her words measured, just making sure everything's in order. William looked at her, his expression neutral but his eyes steady. I'm sure it is, he replied, his tone as even as hers was pointed. The receipt printed with a mechanical hum, breaking the silence. William took it and placed it in his coat pocket. He nodded politely, his upbringing urging him to rise above the slight, even if it sat uneasily within him. As he stepped out of the store, the carton of milk tucked safely under his arm, the sunlight greeted him again, its warmth unchanged, but something inside him felt different, as though the errand had cost him more than a few dollars. He walked home slowly, the weight of the encounter settling over him like a thin, persistent mist. The milk would chill in his refrigerator soon enough, and his tea would taste as it always did. But the bitter aftertaste of the morning lingered, unnoticed by the bustling city around him. The carton of milk rested on the counter, a simple item that should have marked the end of William's errand. Yet, the moment stretched uncomfortably, like a string pulled too taut. Lisa's eyes lingered on him, her fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the register. The subtle rhythm seemed to echo the unspoken tension between them. Is there something else? William asked, his tone measured, his eyes meeting hers. Decades of teaching had given him a voice that could soothe or command. But now it was simply steady, like a boat in calm waters. Lisa didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flicked to the small security mirror above the door, then back to him. We've had some issues lately, she said, her words hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. William didn't move, his expression unreadable. "I see," he replied after a moment, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen far too much of life to be surprised by its disappointments. Lisa shifted on her feet, her discomfort barely concealed. "Just making sure everything's accounted for," she added, her tone clipped but not overtly hostile. It was the kind of statement that could be brushed off as routine casual, even if not for the pointed way she said it, and the way her eyes darted to his hands, his pockets, his coat. William nodded, his face calm, though a quiet indignation stirred within him. He had encountered this before, of course. It was the kind of thing that happened in subtle ways. A glance held too long, a tone too sharp, a question asked too quickly. It was never loud or obvious. It didn't need to be. "I trust your cameras work," he said evenly, motioning toward the small black domes mounted in the corners of the store. His words were not a challenge, but they carried an unmistakable weight. Lisa hesitated, her hand hovering over the register's keyboard. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, caught between her instinct and the nagging possibility that she was wrong. But instead of relenting, she doubled down, her voice firming. "Would you mind waiting here for a moment? Just a quick check." The request hung in the air, heavy and awkward. William stood still, his hand resting lightly on the counter. "Of course," he said, his tone unchanging. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of appearing rattled, though he felt the quiet sting of her words. Lisa disappeared into the back office, leaving William standing alone at the counter. The other customers in the store glanced at him briefly, their expressions flickering with curiosity or discomfort before quickly looking away. No one said anything. They rarely did in moments like these. Silence was easier, safer. William shifted his weight, his fingers brushing the brim of his hat. He could hear the muffled sounds of Lisa moving around in the office. The faint click of a mouse. The rustle of papers. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. The teenagers in the snack aisle whispered to each other, sneaking glances at him. One of them snickered, and William caught the sound. Soft but unmistakable. He felt a pang of something, anger, sadness, perhaps both, but he pushed it aside. There was no use in letting it show. When Lisa finally returned, her face was tight, her expression unreadable. "I didn't find anything," she said, her voice neutral but her posture rigid. William inclined his head slightly, his calm unbroken. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied. His words were polite, but there was an unmistakable edge of quiet defiance beneath them. Lisa handed him his receipt, avoiding his eyes. "Have a good day," she said, the words rushed and perfunctory. William took the receipt and tucked it into his pocket, his movements deliberate. "You as well," he said, his tone as even as ever. He turned and walked out of the store, the bell above the door jingling faintly behind him. Outside, the air was crisp, the sunlight soft and golden. William paused for a moment, letting the tension of the encounter roll off him like water from a stone. He knew better than to carry it with him. The world was heavy enough without adding to its weight. As he made his way home, the carton of milk in hand, he thought about the encounter. It wasn't the first time he had been made to feel small in a space he had every right to occupy. And he knew it wouldn't be the last. But still, he walked on, his steps steady and unhurried, the quiet dignity of his stride unshaken. The morning had passed, but its weight lingered as William set the milk on his kitchen counter. He moved deliberately, as he always did, folding the receipt into his coat pocket before removing his hat and hanging it on the hook by the door. The routine was comforting, but today, it did little to quell the unease that stirred in him. It wasn't anger. Exactly, William had long since learned to temper such feelings, but a quiet ache. An erosion of dignity too familiar to ignore. He sipped his tea in silence, his thoughts drifting back to the store, to Lisa's sharp eyes and the unspoken accusation in her tone. The phone rang, breaking the stillness. He let it ring twice before answering, his voice calm and steady as he greeted the caller. It was Margaret, his neighbor from across the hall, calling to chat about her garden and the weather. William listened patiently, offering polite replies, but his mind wandered. He could still feel the weight of the encounter pressing against him. like a stone lodged beneath his skin. By late afternoon, he decided to take a walk. The streets were quieter now, the hustle of the morning replaced by the subdued rhythm of the day settling in. As he passed the convenience store, he hesitated. He hadn't planned to stop, but something compelled him to step inside once more. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, the sound faint and familiar. The store was nearly empty, save for Lisa at the counter and a man stocking shelves near the back. She glanced up as he approached, her expression briefly flickering with something he couldn't quite place recognition, perhaps, or discomfort. William walked slowly to the back of the store, his movements deliberate. He didn't need anything, the milk he'd bought earlier was still chilling in his refrigerator. But he browsed the shelves anyway, his hands tracing the edges of the items as if searching for something unspoken. Lisa's voice broke the quiet. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "No, thank you," William replied without looking up. He continued browsing, his presence as steady and unassuming as ever. But he could feel her eyes on him, the tension in the air palpable. Minutes passed before William made his way to the counter, a small package of tea in hand. Lisa rang him up quickly, her movements brisk, as she handed him the receipt. Their eyes met briefly. There was a flicker of hesitation in hers, a momentary break in her composed demeanor. "Have a good day," she said, her voice softer this time. William nodded, his face calm but unreadable. "You as well," he replied, his words polite but tinged with a quiet resolve. He left the store without looking back, the package of tea tucked under his arm. The walk home felt heavier than usual. William couldn't shake the sense that the encounter had left something unresolved, a thread of tension lingering in the air. He thought about the years he'd spent teaching, the countless lessons he'd imparted to his students about fairness and understanding. Yet here he was, confronted with the quiet, insidious weight of prejudice once more. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, William sat by his window, watching the world outside, the tea he'd bought steeped in his cup, its warmth spreading through the room. He thought of Lisa, of the way her eyes had lingered on him, the tension in her voice. It wasn't new, he'd seen it before, in different faces, different places, but it still stung, a reminder of the quiet battles fought every day. He closed his eyes, letting the hum of the city wash over him. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another chance to navigate a world that often felt too quick to judge. For now, though, he sat in the stillness, his thoughts heavy but his spirit unbroken. The following morning, Lisa sat in her office at the back of the convenience store, the faint hum of the security monitors filling the small space. The events of the previous day lingered in her mind, a persistent echo of discomfort she couldn't quite shake. She'd been here for years, managing this store, dealing with all manner of people. She'd thought herself fair, objective, yet something about William Carter, his calm, measured presence had unsettled her. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the monitor displaying a live feed of the store. It was quiet now, the early hours of the day marked by a few customers moving briskly through the aisles. Lisa's finger hovered over the keyboard. A thought, nagging and persistent, tugged at her, pulling up the footage from the previous day. She began to watch. There was William, his movements slow and deliberate. As he browsed the shelves, she traced his steps, frame by frame, searching for anything that might have justified her actions. But there was nothing, no hesitation, no furtive glances, just a man quietly going about his day. Her stomach tightened. She thought about the unspoken assumptions she'd carried, the small voice in the back of her mind that had whispered doubt into her actions. She wanted to dismiss it, to explain it away as caution or routine. But she couldn't. Lisa sighed and leaned forward, pulling up older footage from the store's archives. It was a slow day, and curiosity compelled her to dig deeper. She skimmed through weeks, months of recordings, her fingers moving deftly across the keyboard. And then she found it. It was a year ago, nearly to the day. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The store was busier, the aisles crowded. She saw a man, his face obscured by a hoodie, pacing near the counter. Something about his movements caught her attention, jerky, nervous. And then it happened. The man pulled a knife. gesturing wildly at the cashier, who froze in panic. Lisa's breath caught as she watched. The other customers ducked or froze, retreating to the edges of the store. All but one. There was William, stepping forward with a calmness that seemed almost surreal in the chaos. He spoke to the man, his voice muted by the lack of audio but unmistakably steady. The man hesitated, his grip on the knife faltering. William didn't move quickly, didn't grab or shout, but his presence alone seemed to diffuse the situation. Moments later, the man dropped the knife and bolted out the door. William stood there, quietly speaking to the cashier before stepping out of frame. Lisa leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation settling over her like a heavy quilt. She hadn't been working that day. She'd only heard about the incident secondhand. A vague recounting of an attempted robbery. She hadn't known William's role in it. For a long moment, she stared at the screen, her mind churning. The man she had doubted, the man she had humiliated, had once stepped in to protect her store. She felt a wave of shame rise within her, sharp and unrelenting. Lisa closed the footage and sat in silence. She thought about the way she had looked at William, the assumptions she had made without even realizing it. The weight of it pressed against her chest, a reminder of how easy it was to let prejudice seep into the cracks of everyday life. Rising from her chair, she walked to the front of the store. She glanced at the clock. William often stopped by in the mornings. Perhaps she could catch him. She rehearsed an apology in her mind, the words tumbling over one another. But when the doorbell jingled, it wasn't William, it was a delivery driver, nodding at her as he carried in boxes of supplies. Lisa stood there for a moment, her hands fidgeting at her sides. She would wait. She owed him that much. The morning was quieter than usual as William walked the familiar route to the convenience store. The streets, lined with trees shedding their late autumn leaves, seemed more subdued, the occasional car passing like a distant memory of a busier world. He hadn't planned to return to the store so soon, but there was no reason not to. Life, after all, carried on, and so did his routines. The bell above the door jingled as William stepped inside. Lisa, who had been stacking magazines near the counter, straightened abruptly. Her gaze met his, and she froze for a moment before quickly composing herself. "Good morning," William said with his usual calm, his tone as even as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Lisa replied, her voice softer than it had been before. There was an unspoken hesitation in her words, as though she were choosing each one carefully. William nodded and made his way to the back of the store. His steps were unhurried as he browsed the shelves, though he knew exactly what he needed. He picked up a loaf of bread, checking the expiration date before making his way to the counter. As he placed the bread down, Lisa's hands faltered slightly while ringing up the purchase. She looked at him, her lips parting as though to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "I owe you an apology." William raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral but his eyes attentive. He didn't respond immediately, letting her continue. I misjudged you the other day," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as though she were piecing them together for the first time. "I made assumptions I had no right to make, and I treated you unfairly. It was wrong." William studied her for a moment, his face calm but thoughtful. "And what made you realize that?" he asked, his voice steady, free of malice. Lisa hesitated, her cheeks flushing faintly. "I reviewed the security footage," she admitted, "not just from the other day, but from last year too. I saw what you did, how you helped during the robbery." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "I didn't know it was you. I should have, but I didn't. And even if I hadn't known, I still had no excuse for how I treated you." William tilted his head slightly, as if weighing her words. "It's easy to make assumptions," he said finally, his tone reflective. "We all do it, even when we don't mean to. The question is, what do we do once we realize we've been wrong?" Lisa looked down, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the counter. "I want to make it right," she said, her voice almost pleading. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to do better. I need to do better." William nodded slowly, his gaze steady, acknowledging it as the first step. He said, "But doing better, well, that takes time." Lisa swallowed, her discomfort evident. "Please, let me offer you something. The bread, the milk, anything you need today, it's on the house." William's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't need charity, Lisa," he said gently. "What I need is respect. And not just for me, but for everyone who walks through that door." Lisa's face flushed, but she nodded earnestly. "You have my word, Mr. Carter." He picked up the loaf of bread and tucked it under his arm. "Thank you for saying that," he said simply. "Words matter, but actions matter more." Lisa watched as he walked toward the door, her chest heavy with a mix of relief and lingering guilt. When the bell jingled behind him, she let out a slow breath, feeling as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had begun to lift. William stepped into the crisp air, the loaf of bread tucked securely in his hand. He walked with the same quiet dignity he always had, his pace steady and deliberate. The world had not changed. Not in any dramatic sense. But this small moment, a sincere apology, a glimpse of self-awareness, was enough to remind him that even the smallest shifts could make a difference. The streets stretched ahead, familiar and unchanging, and yet, as William walked, he couldn't help but feel that the morning carried a different kind of weight, not of humiliation or anger, but of possibility. William's steps carried him away from the store, but the conversation lingered in his mind like the faint scent of autumn leaves in the air. The city moved around him with its usual rhythm, cars humming down the street, neighbors exchanging pleasantries, but there was a stillness within him, a quiet space carved out by the morning's events. He returned to his apartment, placing the loaf of bread on the counter before settling into his chair by the window. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the pavement, painting the world in muted hues. It was a moment of calm, but William knew it wouldn't last. The weight of his interactions at the store had not lifted entirely, it had merely shifted, spreading into the corners of his thoughts. Meanwhile, Lisa sat in the back office of the convenience store, the hum of the monitors a constant companion. She had replayed her conversation with William several times in her mind, the words etched into her memory like a lesson she couldn't afford to forget. Her apology had been sincere, but sincerity alone wasn't enough. Change required more than words. She glanced at the employee bulletin board, where the store's policies hung in neat rows of printed paper. It struck her how little those words addressed the realities of human interactions, the unspoken biases that shaped so much of daily life. Lisa resolved to bring it up at the next staff meeting, though the thought filled her with unease. Addressing her own shortcomings was one thing, inviting others to do the same was another. The next day, the ripple began. Lisa's staff meeting started like any other, with discussions of inventory and scheduling. But when she brought up her encounter with William, the room grew quiet. Her employees listened as she recounted her mistake, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I realized that I'd made an assumption about someone without even thinking about it," Lisa said. "And it wasn't just about him, it was about the way I've been looking at people for a long time. That has to change." There were murmurs of agreement, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Change was never easy, Lisa thought, but it was necessary. She proposed a new initiative, monthly workshops on unconscious bias, open to all staff. The idea wasn't met with immediate enthusiasm, but there were no objections either. It was a start. Across town, William's story was beginning to spread. The cashier, who had overheard the apology, shared it with a friend, who mentioned it to someone at the community center. By the end of the week, it had become a quiet topic of conversation among the regulars at the local diner. "Did you hear what happened at the store?" one woman asked her companion over coffee. "That man William Carter, I think his name is, he stood up with so much grace. Makes you think, doesn't it?" The conversations weren't dramatic or sweeping. They didn't lead to marches or headlines. But they were there, rippling through the community in subtle ways. A story shared here, a reflection sparked there. It was the kind of change that was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But William understood its power. He saw it in the way people greeted him on his walks. Their smiles a little warmer, their nods a little deeper. He heard it in the way the cashier at the grocery store spoke to him, her tone tinged with an extra note of respect. These were small things, perhaps even imperceptible to someone who hadn't lived a life weighed down by the quiet burdens of prejudice. But to William, they mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting the city in a soft orange glow, William sat on a bench in the park. A group of children played nearby, their laughter ringing out like a song. He watched them, his expression serene but thoughtful. He thought about Lisa, about her apology and the courage it had taken for her to confront her own flaws. He thought about the ripples her actions had set in motion, ripples he could feel but might never fully see. And he thought about the years he had spent walking these streets, carrying the weight of moments like these, moments that had shaped him but never defined him. The world was far from perfect. William knew that, but in the stillness of the evening, as the laughter of children filled the air, he allowed himself a quiet hope. Perhaps change didn't have to be loud or dramatic. Perhaps it could begin with a single conversation, a single apology, and grow from there, spreading quietly, like ripples on a pond. A week after their exchange, Lisa decided to take a step she'd been contemplating since the day she apologized to William. She reached for the phone during a quiet moment at the store, her hand hovering over the number she had scribbled down after asking around at the community center. It was William's. When he answered, his voice was calm, the same measured tone she'd come to expect from him. She introduced herself again, her words slightly hesitant but steady. "Mr. Carter, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to meet with me and my staff. Maybe share your perspective with us." There was a pause on the line. Not long enough to be uncomfortable, but enough for Lisa to imagine the wheels turning in his mind. "You think that would help?" William asked, his voice neither skeptical nor enthusiastic, just thoughtful. "I do," Lisa said, "but I think it would help us more than it would help you." William chuckled softly at that honest answer. He said, "Let me think about it." A few days later, William stepped into the store, this time not as a customer, but as a guest. The staff, gathered in the back room for their monthly meeting, straightened in their chairs as he entered. Lisa stood at the head of the table, her usual air of authority softened by something more genuine gratitude, perhaps, or humility. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "This is Mr. Carter, a longtime member of our community. He's here to share his experiences with us today." William nodded in acknowledgement, his presence calm and unassuming. He didn't come with notes or an agenda, just the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the world around him. "I'm not here to lecture you," he began, his voice steady and warm. "I just want to tell you a bit about what it feels like to move through the world when people don't always see you for who you are." The room was silent as he spoke. He told them about his years as a schoolteacher, about the joy he'd found in shaping young minds, and the quiet frustration of being underestimated by colleagues and parents who assumed his worth before knowing him. He spoke of moments in stores like this one, where suspicion followed him like a shadow, and the toll it took not in loud, obvious ways, but in small, steady drips that eroded his sense of belonging. He didn't point fingers or demand apologies. Instead, he asked questions. Have you ever looked at someone and assumed you knew their story? Have you ever let that assumption shape how you treat them? The staff shifted in their seats, their expressions a mix of introspection and discomfort. Lisa, too, found herself reflecting on the moments she hadn't questioned her own biases, the times she'd allowed them to guide her actions without realizing it. When William finished, the room was quiet for a moment, the weight of his words settling over them. Then one of the younger employees, a cashier named Maria, spoke up. "Thank you for sharing that," she said softly. "I think I've done that before, judged someone without meaning to. I didn't even realize I was doing it." William smiled gently. "It's not about beating yourself up," he said. "It's about noticing. Once you notice, you can change." The meeting ended with a quiet resolve in the air, a sense that something important had begun. As the staff filtered out, Lisa stayed behind to thank William personally. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this," she said. "It's not just the staff, you've made me think, too, about a lot of things." William nodded, his face thoughtful but kind. "Change isn't easy," he said, "but it's worth the effort." As he left the store, Lisa watched him go, her mind filled with plans for how to continue what they had started. She thought about new policies she could implement, about conversations she could encourage among her staff. It wasn't enough to hope for change, she had to work for it. For William, the walk home was quiet and familiar. But his thoughts were lighter than they had been in days. He didn't expect the world to transform overnight, he knew better than that. But he also knew the power of small moments, of conversations that planted seeds. And as he stepped into his apartment, greeted by the soft golden light of the setting sun, he allowed himself a small smile. Change, he thought, often began with the simplest of acts, a willingness to listen. The days grew shorter as winter approached, the golden light of autumn giving way to a softer, silvery hue. William noticed the change on his morning walks, the crisp air now carrying a hint of frost. Life in the neighborhood continued as it always had, familiar yet ever shifting in small, subtle ways. At the convenience store, things felt different too. Lisa had implemented the workshops she had promised, bringing in speakers from the community and encouraging her staff to share their experiences. The store itself hadn't changed, it still carried the same rows of bread and milk, the same neon sign that flickered now and then, but the atmosphere felt lighter, more welcoming. William continued his routine, visiting the store every few days. Each time, Lisa greeted him with genuine warmth, her voice carrying none of the hesitation he had once felt. The other staff members followed her lead, their interactions with William marked by a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. One morning, as William placed a carton of milk on the counter, Lisa handed him his receipt with a smile. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we've been talking about putting together a Community Appreciation Day. A way to bring people together and celebrate the folks who make this neighborhood what it is. I was hoping you'd be our guest of honor." William raised an eyebrow, his expression amused but thoughtful. "Guest of honor? I'm not sure I'm qualified for that." Lisa chuckled. "You're more than qualified," she said. "You've done more for this community than most people realize. And I think it's about time we recognize that." William considered her words, his fingers brushing the brim of his hat. "If it helps bring people together, I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "But only if you promise it won't be too much fuss." Lisa smiled. "No fuss. I promise. Just gratitude." The day of the event arrived with clear skies and a brisk chill in the air. The store's parking lot had been transformed with tables, chairs, and colorful banners. Neighbors gathered, their conversations filled with warmth and laughter. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing out like music. William stood near the front, his presence calm yet commanding. As Lisa stepped forward to address the crowd, she spoke about the importance of community, of learning from one another, and of recognizing the quiet strength in those who walk among us. "Mr. Carter," she said, turning toward him, "your kindness, patience, and dignity have taught us more than we could ever express. This day is for you, and for everything you represent." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, carrying with it the weight of unspoken gratitude. William nodded, his expression serene but deeply moved. When the crowd quieted, he stepped forward, his voice steady as he spoke. "I don't need recognition," he began, "but I do believe in the power of coming together, of listening to each other. We all carry our own stories, and those stories deserve to be seen, to be heard. If we can do that for one another, then maybe, just maybe, we can start to make this world a little lighter." His words settled over the crowd like a soft blanket, their simplicity carrying a profound truth. As the event continued, William moved among the neighbors, sharing quiet conversations and accepting their gratitude with humility. When the day wound down and the banners were taken down, William walked home under the soft glow of streetlights. The carton of milk he had picked up earlier sat in his bag, a small reminder of the ordinary routines that anchored his life. He paused at his apartment door, looking out over the quiet street. The world hadn't changed overnight, but in his neighborhood, there was a sense of something shifting, a willingness to listen, to understand. It wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was there, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the dark. As William stepped inside, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The journey wasn't over, not for him, not for the world, but for now. He was content, Small steps, he thought, could lead to great distances. And he was grateful to have walked this far.